The Eastern Europeans, like the Russians and those guys, they have so much muscle. Like, we look at them and we see them as jacked people. Okay, a lot of times they dominate in sport. They're just big, strong people. What is it about them? I'm sure the genetics play a huge, huge role here. Of course they do. Like, muscle mass is hugely hereditary. But there's also a lifestyle component. Like, what are they eating? What are they doing? And that's the purpose of this video. Now, first off, we need to address the genetic component. That's the boring stuff. We gotta kind of get it out of the way before we can get into the fun stuff, because I want to reverse engineer and understand what it is they're doing. But I also want to look at some of the pitfalls too, because there's some stuff maybe we don't want to be following when it comes down to the Eastern Europeans or the Russians. After today's video, I popped a link down below for 25% off of Seed's Daily Synbiotic. So a 25% discount off of what's called their Synbiotic. This is a probiotic and a prebiotic in one capsule. Seed does a lot of their own research. They publish their own clinicals on this stuff, so they put their money where their mouth is. But when it comes down to adding a probiotic in, this is the only probiotic I've ever added into my diet where I've noticed it within about a week. Noticeable changes in, personally, my appetite, my energy levels. But people that I talk to also, I get emails all the time of people saying that this has changed them. Like, it really does work. And that 25% off discount link, you can't really beat. So that link is down below in the top line of the description underneath this video. If you're making a diet change, it's probably one of the better things to implement in. Okay, so we're gonna start with this study that's published in the journal Strength and Conditioning Research. This is kind of the boring stuff, but you should hear me out on it because it's very important and it is somewhat nuanced. There's this thing called hypoxia-inducible factor 1, HIF-1A. Bottom line is, this is a gene that is really important when it comes down to being able to perform under glycolytic conditions, right? So basically being able to be strong, potentially being able to be fast. There is a polymorphism of this HIF-1A. And what this study set out to find is when it looked at Russian people, it was looking at Russian athletes and some other countries to determine like who had these polymorphisms that might make them better at certain sports, right? So they found that about 13% of weightlifters had this polymorphism. They found about 15.7% of wrestlers had this polymorphism, and only about 7.5% of regular people had this polymorphism. Then it turns out that elite level athletes ended up having about 21% of the people having this polymorphism. My point in saying this is that there is a natural thing that happens where the strongest and the fittest end up kind of floating to the top. You imagine a bunch of kids, okay, 10 years old, they go out and they all play football. Well, the ones that are the best at football are the ones that are going to continue with football, right? Well, it just turns out that a good percentage of those that are the best also might have polymorphisms that could be making them a little bit better when it comes down to like these conditions. My point in saying that is that there is strong reason to speculate that maybe these Eastern Europeans have polymorphisms that make them a little bit better at these kinds of sports, so we maybe see them more. But it's not just about sport. We're talking about just these people in general. They're big, a lot of them are strong, and I just want to understand, so what is it about their diet? Well, it turns out that there was a study published in BMC Public Health that took a look at Russians compared to Central Europeans. It was a big study and got a lot of data from it. So the study took a look at 26,870 people. And bottom line is with Russians, found out that Russians eat about 10% of their fats from polyunsaturated fat. Okay, so that could be like fish oils, it could be nuts. In the case of the United States, it could be things like seed oils. And bottom line, they eat a lot of polyunsaturated fats compared to Central Europe was more like 5-6% polyunsaturated fats. So they eat double the amount of polyunsaturated fats. The other thing that was interesting is they eat a lot more monounsaturated fats. These are the good heart healthy fats. We're talking things like olive oil. I'm not sure if they're consuming olive oil, but you're gonna get monounsaturated fatty acids from nuts. Quite a bit of monounsaturated fatty acids in nuts. Okay, so 16% of their fats are coming from monounsaturated fats. Compare that to Central Europe where it's more like 10-11%. So that's a significant amount more. The other thing that's interesting is that 95% of Eastern Europeans or Russians meet the requirements for iron daily, whereas only about 70% of Central Europeans do. What this tells us is that Russians eat more meat. They're getting more iron in. So with that, let's back up a little bit. Turns out that Russians eat significantly less carbohydrates and significantly more fats than Central Europe. Whereas Central Europe, although still lower carb compared to a lot of Europe, they eat significantly more carbs and significantly less fat and less protein. So the Eastern Europeans, what do they eat? They eat high amounts of fat with a fair bit coming from mono and polyunsaturated fats. They eat a fair bit of protein, a lot of protein, and a lot of red meat because they're getting their iron in, and they eat relatively low carb. And I know from other studies that I've looked at and other videos that I've done, they actually eat a lot of root vegetables when they do eat the carbohydrates that they're eating. So what's interesting is we've seen literature that shows that Russia and Eastern Europe actually have some of the lowest levels of diabetes in the world. But what's interesting is they actually have some of the highest levels of cardiovascular disease. I'm not saying that the meat is causing that. I know that's what you could be thinking, but we have to look at the big picture, and we will get to that in this video and unpack it all. Now, when it comes to the omega-3s, the polyunsaturated fatty acids, there is strong evidence that omega-3s can help with muscle protein synthesis. So there's a study published in Clinical Sciences that found that omega-3s combined with amino acid supplementation led to about a 50% increase in mTOR and what is called P70S6K. This is muscle protein synthesis. So basically, a high level of these potential fats with a high protein diet is a recipe for more muscle protein synthesis, which might just make sense with Eastern Europeans. What about with monounsaturated fats? Well, we know from a study published in Aging and Clinical and Experimental Research that looked at over 3,700 people that low levels of monounsaturated fatty acids are associated with lower levels of muscle. So if you're not getting enough MUFAs in, you might not hold on to your muscle. But then there's some interesting in vitro studies that we can't entirely take to the bank, but we've seen other stuff replicated in rodent models too. Monounsaturated fatty acids seem to increase insulin sensitivity, which may have a role in how they can build muscle, how people can build muscle. If you're more insulin sensitive, you're gonna be more sensitive to the insulin spikes, to the potential insulin-genic nature of protein, allowing you to build more muscle, which also might add up as to why maybe the Russians have such better levels of blood sugar compared to many places in the world. And then of course we have the iron side of things. This is plain and simple. This is telling us they eat more meat and they probably eat more red meat. There was an interesting study that demonstrated that independent of BMI, independent of weight, independent of inflammation, if you had low levels of ferritin and transferritin, so basically iron and the ability to distribute iron, that was associated with lower levels of creatinine, which is associated with lower levels of muscle mass. So the lower your iron, the lower your muscle, typically speaking. Okay, well, it's no surprise. If Russian people eat a bunch of high fat, relatively low carb, and a lion's share of their calories from protein, they're gonna be built like brick houses. And that just adds up. So now we understand that. But there's another attribute or series of attributes that we probably need to address because it's just reality. Eastern Europeans and Russians are tough. Okay, almost everyone that you would encounter in Russia is related to someone that's in prison or been in prison or the gulag. Okay, they've migrated over crazy terrain. You've got people that have migrated through Siberia. And a lot of this stuff has happened not in the so recent past. When kids grow up in Russia, they fight on the streets. There's hardship. It's cold. Conditions kind of suck in a lot of cases. So we cannot deny the fact that that breeds a tough environment, which probably has them having a little bit more of a better threshold for pain and a better tolerance just for dealing with crappy situations. So we cannot deny that. If you have the ability to deal with things, you're probably gonna be a tougher, stronger person in the gym. A lot of times it has to do with that. But now we have to get real here for a second. They eat a lot of meat, they eat a lot of fat, and they happen to have the highest levels of cancer and cardiovascular disease. And there's a study published in the European Journal of Nutrition that found that the stronger that someone would adhere to an Eastern European diet, the higher their risk of CVD and cancer. How do you explain this? It's interesting though, because it would make sense based upon the diet that they would have lower instances of diabetes. They actually eat a fair bit of fiber from their buckwheat and their kasha, things like that. High amount of protein, all these things that are good metabolically. But there's some literature that supports the fact that they eat a ton of meat and a ton of animal product. Is that associated with cardiovascular disease? It is, but there's huge discrepancy there. There was a study that was published in The Lancet that took a look at the 25 most populated cities, and it found that Russia had the highest animal meat, or animal protein, I should say, consumption. Okay, 5.8 servings per day compared to the UK at 3.7, India at like 0.7, just to give you context. So a lot of animal product. Here's what's interesting. The amount of meat that Russians eat is a lot. The amount of processed meat that Russians eat is a whole lot. Look at the map that is on the screen. What this map shows is two different maps. The map up top shows regular unprocessed meat. The map down below shows processed meat. Notice how Russia is dark blue, showing a lot of meat consumption, but it's also dark blue, showing a lot of processed meat consumption. So they're jacked and, well, I would say tan, but they're up north, so they're jacked and pale. So they're jacked because they eat a lot of protein, but the same thing that's making them jacked is the fact that they're eating whatever protein comes their way, even though that may mean high amounts of processed protein. Now, I want you to compare this to some other countries. Look at China, for example. China has a good life expectancy, as much as it's crazy to think. Okay, decent life expectancy. They eat a lot of meat, but not a ton of processed meat. See, the lighter the shade, the less consumption. So dark blue on the regular meat, but light blue on the processed meat. Notice how America is kind of in the, it's not dark blue, but it's like medium blue on both. So basically implying that most of the meat that we eat in the United States is a mix. We probably eat 50% regular meat and 50% processed meat. And then you look at countries like Croatia and Slovenia. Look at South Africa down there. Dark blue on regular meat, light blue on processed meat. That's the way we want to be. So Russia has a lot of good things going, but I think what's going on is they're starting to, well, of course there's the alcohol consumption, but there's also a lot of unhealthy packaged, processed garbage going on there. So they've got the metabolic side right by not having a high amount of sugar and things like that, but they're missing the mark when it comes down to the quality of the protein they could be consuming. If you look at the Nordic regions do it right. They have a lot of meat consumption, but they're getting it from game. They're getting a lot of game meat. Now, I know that's not realistic for everybody, but it just goes to show the quality of the meat does matter. Out of the 7 countries that have the longest life expectancy, 3 of them are in the Nordic region. So they have a lot of what the Eastern Europeans have with the protein consumption, the lower carb, the higher fat. They have the omega-3 influence, but we could take a lesson from them with slightly higher quality protein. As always, keep it locked in here on my channel. See you tomorrow.